you were talking about this kind of as, if we go back from the disorder side of things to the personality trait side of things, in order to understand it, it's good to see, where it manifests in all of us, I guess, as well. And so maybe we could talk about what is the difference between a personality trait and a disorder, and how personality kind of traits, how they're mapped really in psychology.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot to go there. My general approach to personality is that people's personality is, there's these kind of averages we have, but what's really important is to be flexible in our personality. So with something like being grandiose, if I'm on stage in front of like 100 people and I'm a big expressive personality, it's great. I get a lot of positive feedback. That's great. But if I hold that with me and go on my next interaction where I'm with 2 people in a room and I'm like big personality and I'm waiting for that adulation, I'm not getting it. I have to be able to turn my personality on, and I have to dial it back. And then when I'm in another relationship and I have to be a caregiver, I have to be able to change face, go, look, this isn't about me, Keith. I got to help this person. So in life, we're often turning our personality on and off. When your personality gets rigid and extreme, inflexible, that's where it gets dangerous, because you're not really able to shift across situations. So one of the things that can become disordered with personality is when it's inflexible. You just can't move it. Second is extreme. So if you're extreme and inflexible, it's just going to make you hard to navigate through life, unless you really structure your life. Like if you're really narcissistic and you're an emperor and you just have the yes people and you behead people you don't like. I mean, you can build a life that you can allow a lot of narcissism, but generally it's hard because the world doesn't let you be who you want. So having a personality that's extreme and inflexible can lead to problems. And then if you have those problems, it can be diagnosed as a disorder. So extreme, inflexible, and then the usual things with personality disorders, they have to exist since childhood, they have to be over time. So if you were just a normal dude and all of a sudden you just got a huge head and for like a week you became a narcissistic maniac, my first thought would be, did James get into the cocaine? Or is James having a bipolar episode? If it's something that just happens quickly, you wouldn't look for personality. The idea of personality, it's something in your character, it's something that's been there your whole life, that's maybe become magnified into a disorder, and then maybe it will go down and be less of a disorder and be just kind of a personality. Maybe you've just got extreme personality, but it's not really disorder. So that's the idea. And I can keep going. So tell me where you want me to go with this. It's get really big.
Yeah, I mean, I want to seize on that inflexibility point because it's interesting as well. You mentioned that kind of cocaine can push people in the direction of kind of the grandiose narcissistic dynamic, and that strongly suggests there's a very kind of perhaps quite straightforward neurobiological aspect to it. But then also on the psychological side, I tend to see, if I think about what the ego is and what personality is, just from through my own lens of how I think about life and the mind. I kind of see it as a coping mechanism, even in the healthiest of us. It's a way to kind of get through life, and so the inflexibility to me feels like, if you bring in the trauma piece, that in some cases you could have someone who's basically they've got their coping mechanism and they're sticking to it as hard as they can because of some fear, some trauma in the past.
And that makes sense to me. And so that trauma seems to keep people stuck a little bit.
Right.
And so they can't really adapt. The reason I don't talk about trauma a lot with narcissism, it's not specific. I mean, trauma leads to pathology across the board. It's not specific to narcissism. So as an academic, I was never like, well, let's figure out the trauma because that's the key. It's just that seems to be an overall problem across personality disorders.
Right.
But the more I've talked to people about it, like talking to you and talking to all these people about narcissism, it seems that in real life, lots of these problems are the combination of narcissism with some trauma that's leading these people to become rigid and inflexible and becoming a bit of petty tyrants and hurting people. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned in the book that there are multiple different models people have suggested, whether it's evolutionarily, whether it's kind of, genetic and I think something that's fascinating about this, as just a kind of a way into thinking about the mind is that it is a cocktail. It's a mix of all these different things, right? There's a bit of evolutionary component, but then, and maybe the reason, some of us seize on the trauma component is because we're like, well, if we can avoid that childhood trauma in the next generation, maybe people might still be a bit grandiose, a bit narcissistic in terms of their trait, but maybe we can get rid of the inflexibility or soften that a bit.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that, because trauma, I think, is an issue. I tend to be very, like, when I think about things, I just grab all the maps I have. So I've got like my evolutionary map that's pretty good, and I've got my, big 5 personality map, which I really have a good one, and I have my, basic biology map, which is terrible, and my self map, which is William James map, which is really good, and I just use them all. But when you think about something like narcissism, you can think about it at all levels. So you can think about it from very basic kind of biological drive. So approach orientation is something we might call about it, and might be like a dopamine reward system, maybe in the more biological neuroscience side of it, but really reward system. And that reward system, when it filters through the self, you kind of filter it up through the self, it becomes self-enhancement. So the reward is, I'm the best, I'm going to get rewards by getting positive feedback. So basic reward, when it gets into the self or the ego, becomes self-enhancement or self-adulation, self-expansion. And then so narcissism kind of maybe is at this more extreme personality end, but at the very basic level, it's about reward seeking, getting goals, and then associating those goals with the ego. And I mean, that's how I'd play it out if I used all those things.